This is lecture 6A. We're going to talk about the unification of China. Now, the last time I talked about China, I talked about the first three dynasties, the Jia, the Shang, and the Zhou. And these dynasties don't have a whole lot of good records for them, especially the Jia and the Shang. We basically just have archaeological records, oracle bones, etc. But by the time you get to the Zhou, we have a lot of written records. And we know that the last several hundred years of the Zhou dynasty were a period of sort of dissolution, that the central government became weaker and weaker, and because of that, each of the individual regions and provinces that made up the Zhou dynasty began to operate more independently. And now the Zhou dynasty was organized feudally, which meant that basically it wasn't systematically organized by territory, but rather the emperor had a bunch of aristocrats around him, and those aristocrats each had a chunk of territory they controlled, and then they would break that up and give control of subregions to other aristocrats. And so the regions were sort of natural military units because each feudal lord had the loyalty of those in that region and could draw on that region. So as the central government got weaker, each of these regions began to operate more independently, and eventually they started fighting. And the period between 403 BC and 221 BC is called the Warring States period. And during this time, there was enormous amounts of chaos and suffering. I mean, basically, these armies were marching back and forth between kingdoms, and they would burn down villages and cities. They would destroy crops. They would slaughter livestock in order to hurt the other kingdom. So peasants, were dying in droves from starvation and things because of that. It was also a period where famines led to disease, and you had epidemic diseases ripping through the population. And finally, even at court, you had all sorts of intrigues. There were assassinations, and there were double crossings, and all sorts of machinations and cabals and things like that. So it was really a very nasty time period, and the society as a whole was suffering because of a lack of overall leadership. Well, the overall leadership finally emerged in the person of Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang was born as the son of the king of the Qin kingdom. And when he was 13, his father died, and he became king. Now, there were a lot of machinations about his early life before he became an adult, but he eventually took control of the kingdom and became quite a capable leader. He was both a good sort of military strategist, but also a really good organizer and systematizer. And so essentially what he does, he came to power in 247, although he was only 13 years old at the time. And he, by about the 230s, he began to systematically attack the other kingdoms in the Zhou dynasty. There were 7 kingdoms, and he's one of them, and so he's attacking the other 6. Incidentally, as a side note, one of the first kings to be attacked, it was a neighboring kingdom, and they recognized that they were way too weak to stop Qin Shi Huang Di from conquering them. So they sent an assassin who had a knife rolled up in a map, and he was going to give him the map as a gift. And when the emperor unrolled the map, the assassin took out the knife and tried to stab him with it. He failed. But there's actually a movie about that, a highly fictionalized account called Hero, starring Jet Li from 2002, and which is about this assassination attempt, I think. In any case, and one other note on Qin Shi Huang Di, the name he was given at birth was Yin Shang, but it was customary when someone became the king of a kingdom to take the kingdom name as their last name. So and then when he became emperor, he gave himself the name of Shi Wang, which means sparkling celestial god or something like that, and then Di is just the title for emperor. But in any case, by 221, Qin Shi Huang had united all of the old Zhou dynasty, and then he invades southern China, which had never been part of the Zhou dynasty, south of the Yangtze River, and he conquers the modern provinces of Hunan and several other provinces. So he unifies a big chunk of what we would today call China. Now, some of the western regions of modern China were not included in the Qin dynasty, but the entire coast of what we would call China, and then significant regions inland, were all unified under the Qin dynasty. And Qin Shi Huang was a really good centralizer and organizer. He recognized that there was lots of things that he had to do to unify this enormous kingdom. Now, I talked with the Persian empires. I talked about how the fact that beginning at about 500 BCE with the classical societies, you see the emergence of these much larger governments ruling much larger territories. And they had to do a whole bunch of things in order to manage this much larger territory. Qin Shi Huangdi does those things also. So a big part of his government project is simply creating this government apparatus that can rule a large empire. That includes a lot of things. He built a lot of roads and canals to facilitate trade, but also to facilitate the movement of troops around the kingdom and to facilitate communications. He created... He was the one who finally standardized the Chinese writing system, creating a single standardized writing system that could be used by people speaking different languages, and that really helped to unify the Qin dynasty. He also built the first version of the Great Wall of China. Now, various kingdoms had smaller walls, chunks of walls, to keep out the nomadic peoples from Central and Northern Asia, in particular the Xiongnu people. Qin Shi Huangdi took all those walls and turned it into one massive 1,300-mile long wall. It was made out of what's called rammed earth, which is where you basically build a frame, a mold, and you put dirt in it. You keep packing the dirt down by ramming tree trunks basically into it, and it creates this rock-hard, almost concrete-hard wall. So he created a single unified Great Wall of China that way. Now, the Great Wall of China you see today actually had, by 1300, Qin Shi Huangdi's wall had fallen apart mostly, and so the Ming Dynasty built the modern wall that's made out of brick in the 1300s. So he builds the Great Wall of China. He builds all these roads and canals. He standardizes the language, the writing system. He creates a bureaucracy. But he also imposed a really strict control on society. He was famous for burning a lot of books. Now, partly that was just to get rid of the old writing system so that people had to use the new writing system. But partly he was also trying to destroy the histories of other kingdoms. He was trying to destroy anything that didn't serve his sort of propaganda purposes. In addition, he had a system of forced labor. He forced peasants to work on the Great Wall or on roads and canals and things. And this led to enormous resentment. And some historians have estimated that several 100,000 people probably died building the Great Wall for Qin Shi Huangdi. And so he was creating a very centralized government. Standardized coinage, standardized language, etc. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized how wide carts could be, so that they would all fit so they could build roads that fit the carts. So he had a lot of this sort of standardization and centralization, but he was breeding enormous amounts of resentment. All right. Now, Qin Shi Huangdi was really powerful and really capable. And so he faced a number of assassination attempts, but no major rebellions during his reign. But what undid him was that he was actually afraid of death. He wanted to live forever. And throughout his adult life, he was constantly looking for alchemists who could come up with an elixir that would allow him to live forever. And there's some speculation that what actually killed him was that he was taking some pills that an alchemist had told him would make him live forever. But their main ingredient was mercury, which is highly toxic. In any case, Qin Shi Huangdi dies in 210 BCE, and he's immediately succeeded by his second son, but there's so much built-up resentment that when the fear of Qin Shi Huangdi disappears, there's massive rebellions all over the whole kingdom, the whole empire. And so the son very quickly gets overthrown, and the Qin dynasty falls apart, but almost immediately a new dynasty would emerge in its place. The Han Dynasty would be founded in 2006, or 206 BCE. And essentially what happens is that a coalition of nobles very quickly decide to reestablish the centralized control of the Qin dynasty. But they're going to they basically say there were lots of good things about the Qin dynasty, about having it unified with the roads and the unified currency and the unified language, etc. We want to capitalize on that, but Qin Shi Huangdi himself was too harsh, and so we think we can make this work without it, without his harsh tactics. So essentially what the Han Dynasty does then is, the Han Dynasty actually, it would last for roughly 400 years. And it's divided into two parts. There's this interior part where the Han Dynasty is taken over by a sort of renegade bureaucrat who tries to implement something like we would call socialism. But when he dies, the Han Dynasty comes back. They reestablish it. So basically, the early Han Dynasty, the first half of it is from 206 BCE to 9 CE. And then the second half of the Han Dynasty is from 25 CE to 220 CE. And this is roughly the same time period as the Roman Empire. I mean, this is the heyday of the Roman Republic, and then this is the heyday of the Roman Empire. So keep in mind that the ancient Rome and the Han Dynasty are roughly contemporary. Rome began a little earlier and ended a little later, but they're roughly contemporary. Okay, so the Han Dynasty inherits basically the territory of the Qin Dynasty, and they managed to keep together a lot of what Qin Shi Huangdi had set up, and they continue that, and so they create a area of stabilization. But they also implement some new things that go even beyond Qin Shi Huangdi. First of all, they adopt Confucianism as the primary or the official philosophy of the Chinese government. And from that point onward, they actually set up a system where bureaucrats who enter the government have to pass an examination in Confucian principles. And this, and in various ways, I mean, some governments would turn away from this, but for the most part, this Confucian foundation of Chinese government and society would last, with Confucian as the official government of various Chinese dynasties, all the way up until the 20th century. And so it provides enormous stability. And for reasons I'll talk about in the second part of the lecture when I talk about Confucianism. But they institute Confucianism as a sort of a social philosophy to try to hold society together and stabilize it. They also create a much bigger bureaucracy with trained bureaucrats to run this kingdom, and it becomes a more efficient kingdom. But then they keep everything that Qin Shi Huangdi did. They keep his road system and expand on that. They maintain the Great Wall of China. They maintain the currency. They use the unified Chinese language. So there's a bunch of ways in which this the Han Dynasty, the Qin and Han Dynasties, are essentially doing very similar things to what the Achaemenid Empire did in Persia in terms of solidifying, stabilizing a really large multi-ethnic society by creating a centralized government with trained bureaucrats, a standardized currency, good communication, transportation, a good economy, a good tax system, etc. So the similar process is going on in both Persia and in China. And this is the result of classical societies getting bigger, right, and more complicated. One final thing I want to point out is that the Achaemenids and the Sassanids had adopted Zoroastrianism as sort of their official religion. And they had used that to convince people to sort of obey the government, etc., that the gods wanted the government in place. In China, the adoption of Confucianism serves a similar function, that the Confucianism is not technically a religion, although some people, it has some later additions that make it sort of like a religion, but it really doesn't have, Confucianism doesn't have a larger sense of who the gods are or what happens to your soul after death or anything like that. Instead, Confucianism is just a moral code or a social philosophy about how society should be organized, but it serves the same function as a lot of these religions do in classical societies, in that it gives everybody an idea of how people are supposed to behave, and it prescribes a personal morality to guide individual behavior that helps the whole society to be stable and function smoothly. Right? And we're going to see that, when I talk about the Bhagavad Gita, we'll see that there also, how Hinduism serves that function in India. And in the next part of the lecture, I'll talk about how Confucianism serves that function in China.